I'm Sarah, a tutor at Accountancy Learning, and in this video I'll take you through the Management Accounting Techniques AAT Sample Paper 1 Task 2. So in Task 2 then, it's going to be about attributing costs. So let's have a look at our first question. Identify whether the following statements about activity-based costing are true or false. Statement number 1, cost drivers are used to determine the causes of costs. So with activity-based costing, overheads are actually apportioned by identifying the principal activities that create the costs or those that are closely related. So these are known as cost drivers. So that would then make the first statement true. For the second one then, overheads are charged to production on the basis of direct labour hours or machine hours. So with activity-based costing, production isn't charged based on labour or machine hours, as sometimes there's not actually many to do so. So it actually uses the cost driver to apportion the overheads. So statement number 2 is false. The next part then is complete the following statement. Under absorbed overheads are, and we either need to select debited or credited, to the bank account or statement of profit or loss. So when we're talking about under absorbed overheads, it means there's still some cost left to expense somewhere. So if we have a look at a basic example then, if our actual overheads were 100,000 and our absorbed overheads were 90,000, it means there is £10,000 of overheads that hasn't actually been absorbed. So we've only taken £90,000, but our actual is £100,000. So this £10,000 here isn't actually shown anywhere. So that's going to be an additional expense to us because our absorbed overheads are lower than our actual. So as this is now going to be an expense to the business, our underabsorbed overheads are going to be debited as we're going to be increasing the expenses, and it's going to go to our statement of profit or loss. So those underabsorbed overheads will debit the statement of profit or loss and therefore reduce the profit of the business. Moving on to the next part then. So in this part we are given a fair amount of information. And first of all, just to bring your attention to this sentence here, that in your exam you will be able to open this up by clicking a button on the right hand side, and you'll be able to have the information on one side of your screen and the exam question on the other, so you don't need to worry about scrolling up and down. So let's look at the question then. Stable Glazing Limited is a manufacturer of windows and doors. It has 2 cost centres, windows and doors, and 1 service centre, administration. We're then given all the budgeted overheads for the year, and we're given some different information as well about how things are apportioned across the different departments. So let's have a look at the question then. So allocate and apportion the overheads to the 3 departments and reapportion the administration department's overheads to windows and doors to complete the table below. enter your answers to the nearest whole pound and use minus signs to indicate any negative figures. So it's really important we keep that in mind, how and what format our answers need to be in. So let's first of all have a look at how we are going to allocate it. So on what basis we are going to allocate. So first of all, administration salaries. So if we look at the information that we're given, we can see that our administration salaries are just given to us here. So that is just going to be allocated. So in the question, you will have these options here in your drop down. So the administration salaries will simply be on the allocated basis. And you can see that the exam question gives you the 58,000 already. For the equipment depreciation, we've got to choose from one of these four options again. So we wouldn't be looking at receptionist time. It hasn't got anything to do with the equipment. Floor area, no, doesn't really take into account anything about equipment. Allocated, it isn't allocated, we haven't been given the figure, and therefore we are left with carrying amount of equipment. So that's going to be our answer for the basis. Now let's start to fill in the rest of the question. So we need to look at the receptionist's time and their salary, and we are going to allocate that on receptionist time. So in the question, we have the receptionist salary at 18,000. And in our additional information, we've got 75% of the receptionist time goes to windows and 25% goes to doors. So our calculation is going to be for the receptionist salary, we're going to have windows and doors. So 18,000, and for windows it was 75%. So 75% of that 18,000 needs to be charged to windows, which gives us 13,500, and 25% is charged to doors, which gives us 4,500. So we can now put the figures in. So it's a total of 18,000, 13,500 to windows, and 4,500 to doors. Next, we need to look at our rent and rates, and we can see that we need to do it on floor area basis. So rent and rates then, we've got £65,000 budgeted overheads, and our floor area here, we've then got 240 square metres for windows, 150 for doors, and 110 for administration. So first of all, we need to work out what the total floor area is. So we need to add all of these together, which gives us a total of 500 square metres. So for our rent and rates, we're going to be looking at splitting the rent and rates over that 500 square metres and then allocating the relevant square metres per department. So for windows, we would do 65,000, which is the total of the rent and rates, divide it by the total square meters that are available, and then multiply it by the 240 square meters that Windows takes up. Therefore, their share of the rent and rates will be 31,200. Then we're going to do the same for doors. So again, 65,000, divide it by the total square meterage, and then multiply it by the square meterage for doors, and you get 19,500. And for the administration department, you do the same calculation, and you just times it by the 110 square meters to get the administration share. So we can now fill in the boxes. 65,000 is our total rent and rates, and we're going to give 31,200 to windows, 19,500 to doors, and 14,300 to administration. Now in the exam, the totals in this row here will auto sum. So just for completeness, I'm now going to write in the totals that would be showing in your exam question. Now we need to be looking at reapportioning the administration overheads. Let's have a look again at what we are told here. The administration department's overheads are reapportioned to the cost centres as follows. So it's this bit here we're going to be looking at. 60% of the administration overheads are going to go to windows, and 40% is going to go to doors. So we're going to be using this figure here as our total administration overheads. So therefore, we are going to reapportion them by doing 73,050, and for doors, we're going to multiply that, for windows, apologies, we're going to multiply that by 60%, which is 43,830. So that's our windows. And then we'll do the same calculation for doors at 40%, which is 29,220. So we can now put these in as our reapportioned administration costs. So for windows, you would have 43,830, doors 29,220. And then don't forget, you then need to make sure we're going to zero out the administration costs. So it will then be minus 73,050, because those costs now no longer exist, because we've now shared them across windows and doors. And then once again, in the exam, the totals at the bottom will auto sum. But again, for completeness, I will add them in here. And then there, you can see that we are then down to 0 in administration. Moving on to the next part of the question. We're then given some actual results for stable glazing for the year. So we are then asked to calculate the overhead absorption rates for the windows and doors department using the most appropriate basis to 2 decimal places. So we're looking at overhead absorption rates in this question. So when you're looking at this, we need to use the most intensive. And that's really important. So if we look up back at our information that we are given here, our budgeted labour hours for windows is 8,700 and 5,100 from doors. So our labour hours for windows is the most intensive, it's the higher number. Budgeted machine hours for windows is 4,650, but for doors it's 5,430. So that one is the most intensive basis. So we're going to be using labour hours for our windows and machine hours for our doors. So I'm just going to write up here labour hours for windows, machine hours for doors, so we've got those figures to hand. So to calculate our overhead absorption rates for windows and doors, we are going to take the figures that we have got from our previous question, and we are going to be using these figures here as our total overheads to calculate our overhead absorption. So again, I'm just going to write the windows and doors in here so we have it to refer to. So for windows then, we've got 129,630 and we're dividing that, remember, by our labour hours, which gives us £14.90 per labour hour. And for doors, we will do the same calculation, except we're going to use the machine hours as our most intensive to give us £17. And remember to put in the 2 zeros after the decimal point because we are working to 2 decimal places. Then we're asked to calculate the overhead absorbed for the windows and doors department, and this time we enter our answers to the nearest whole pound. So what we now need to do is work out what has actually been absorbed based on our actual hours using our overhead absorption rates that we've just worked out. So for windows then, we're going to be using our actual labour hours for windows, the most intensive, and actual machine hours for doors as the most intensive for that one. So windows is 8,620 hours multiplied by our 1490 from the previous question, and that will give us 128,438. And our doors will be the 5,756 hours multiplied by the £17, which is £97.50. 852. So that's the actual overheads that have already been absorbed. So for the final part of the question, we then need to calculate the amount of under or over absorbed overheads for both departments. And again, we are entering to the nearest whole pound. So for this one then, we are going to be looking at what has been absorbed, which is coming from here. And what should have been absorbed from the actual overheads, which is going to come from here. So the actuals $29,325 for windows and $96,780 for doors. So let's now calculate. We've got our should be absorbed for windows is 129,325. So this is the should have been absorbed. We're going to minus what has actually been absorbed, which is what we've just worked out here, which leaves us with 887 that should have been absorbed. So this is the actual, so what has been, and because this is lower than the should, it means there is some left over, so we haven't absorbed all of it, so that would make it under absorbed. And then for doors, what we should have absorbed is the actual overheads of 96,780. What we've actually absorbed is 97,852. Which means we then get this little negative figure here because what's actually been absorbed is higher than what should have been absorbed. So that means we've actually taken on more of that expense. So therefore that would be over. That would be under absorbed, and doors is over absorbed. And it's really important when you're working out whether something is under or over is look at what should have been absorbed by your actuals, and then have a look at what has been absorbed based on the hours and your overhead absorption rate.